In the summer of 1943, Soviet tank crews discovered something terrifying. Their reliable T-34s, which had dominated the steppes of Russia for 2 years, were suddenly being shredded at distances they couldn't even return fire. The Germans had unleashed a monster, the Tiger I, 56 tons of steel wrapped around an 88mm gun that could penetrate Soviet armor from over 1,000 meters away. And behind it came something even more frightening, the Panther, with its sloped armor that could deflect almost anything the Soviets threw at it. The Red Army needed an answer. They needed something that could meet these steel beasts head-on and destroy them. What they created was the IS-2, a tank so powerful that a single hit from its cannon could tear the turret clean off a Tiger. This is the story of the Soviet hammer that smashed the Wehrmacht's heavy armor. By early 1943, the Soviet Union faced a crisis. Their KV-1 heavy tanks, once the pride of the Red Army, had become obsolete. These 47-ton monsters carried the same 76mm gun as the T-34 medium tank, but without the T-34's speed and mobility. They were expensive to build, difficult to maintain, and frankly not worth the resources. Moscow ordered some KV-1 production lines to shift to T-34 manufacturing. The heavy tank program seemed dead, but then intelligence reports started flooding in from the front lines. The Germans were fielding something new, something devastating. In January 1943, Soviet forces managed to capture an intact Tiger I. When engineers at the Kubinka Proving Grounds examined it, they were stunned. This wasn't just another German tank, it was a fortress on tracks. 100mm of frontal armor, an 88mm gun that could kill from ranges Soviet tankers couldn't even dream of engaging from. The Tiger could destroy a T-34 at 2,000 meters. The T-34 needed to close to 500 meters just to have a chance of penetration. Those were suicide odds. The Soviet High Command issued an urgent directive. They needed a new heavy tank, one that could match the Tiger in firepower and protection. But this being the Soviet Union in wartime, there was a catch. It had to be simple enough for unskilled workers to build in factories still recovering from evacuation. It had to use existing components wherever possible, and it had to enter production immediately. The design bureau led by Khotin, the same man behind the KV series, got to work. Their solution was called Object 237, later redesignated the IS-1, the Josef Stalin tank. The name change came after Kliment Voroshilov, the previous namesake of Soviet heavy tanks, fell out of political favor. In Stalin's Soviet Union, even tanks needed to mind their politics. The IS-1 used the same hull and running gear as the KV series, but with vastly improved armor layout. Where the KV-1 wasted weight with thick armor even on the rear, the IS-1 concentrated its protection where it mattered, the front. The glacis plate was 120mm thick, angled, at 30 degrees. This meant even the Tiger's 88mm gun would struggle to penetrate it at combat ranges. The turret was completely redesigned with better sloping and a welded construction that was easier to manufacture than the KV's cast turret. For armament, the IS-1 carried an 85mm D5T gun. This was the same weapon being developed for the new T-34-85. It could penetrate the Tiger I from 1,000 meters, finally giving Soviet tankers a fighting chance. The IS-1 entered production in October 1943 at the Chelyabinsk factory, nicknamed Tankograd for its massive tank production. But even as the first IS-1 tanks rolled off the assembly lines, Soviet engineers knew they had a problem. By late 1943, intelligence reported that the Germans weren't standing still. They had upgunned the T-34 to carry the same 85mm weapon. If a 30-ton medium tank could carry the same firepower as a 46-ton heavy tank, what was the point of the heavy tank? The IS-1 needed more firepower, something that would justify its weight and cost. Two options emerged. The first was the D-10 100mm gun based on a naval weapon. It had excellent armor penetration, around 185mm at point-blank range. It was accurate, had a relatively flat trajectory for long-range shooting, and used single-piece ammunition that was quick to load. The second option was the A-19 122mm gun, a massive field artillery piece adapted for tank use. It had less raw penetration than the 100mm, around 160mm with standard armor-piercing shells. But It fired a shell that weighed 25 kilograms compared to the 100 millimeters 15-kilogram projectile. When that 122 millimeter shell hit something, it didn't just penetrate armor, it demolished it. The debate was intense. The 100 millimeter was clearly the better anti-tank weapon on paper. Better accuracy, faster to reload, more capable of precise shooting at range. But the 122 millimeter had something the 100 millimeter couldn't match: devastating high explosive capability. Remember, the IS series wasn't designed purely as a tank destroyer. Its primary role was breakthrough, smashing through fortified German defensive lines, destroying bunkers, pillboxes, and entrenched infantry positions. The 122 millimeters high explosive shell, weighing 25 kilograms and packed with 3.8 kilograms of TNT, could demolish a concrete bunker or blow the turret off any German tank, even if it didn't penetrate the armor. There was also a practical consideration. The Soviet Union had excess production capacity for the A-19 and its ammunition. The 100 millimeter was a new weapon in short supply. In the desperate arithmetic of wartime production, the 122 millimeter made sense. They could build more IS-2 tanks faster with the 122 millimeter than waiting for 100 millimeter guns to become available. The decision was made. The IS-2 would carry the 122 millimeter D-25T gun, a tank-adapted version of the A-19. Soviet testing claimed it could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther at 2,500 meters. German testing later disputed this, suggesting the gun couldn't penetrate the Panther's upper glacis at any range when the tank was angled. The truth was probably somewhere in between, and in combat, other factors mattered more than laboratory testing. Production of the IS-2 began in December 1943. The first combat deployment came in April 1944 when the 11th and 72nd Independent Guards, heavy tank regiments, engaged German Panther tanks. The results were dramatic. When that 122 millimeter shell connected, Panthers didn't just get penetrated, they got catastrophically destroyed. Turrets were blown off, hulls split open. Even when the shell didn't penetrate, the sheer kinetic energy and explosive force could knock out a Panther through mechanical shock alone. One Soviet report described a 122 millimeter armor-piercing shell hitting the front of a Panther from 2,500 meters. The shell ricocheted off, but the impact left huge breaches in the armor plating. The Panther was combat-killed without the shell ever entering the tank. But the 122 millimeter gun had a critical weakness, one that would haunt the IS-2 throughout its service life. The reload time was painfully slow. The D-25T used two-piece ammunition. The loader had to first load the massive 25-kilogram shell, then the separate powder charge. In a well-trained crew, this process took between 20 and 30 seconds. Compare that to the German 88 millimeter on the Tiger I, which could fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute, or a shot every 7 to 10 seconds. In tank versus tank combat, this was a massive disadvantage. An IS-2 crew had to make their first shot count, because if they missed, the German tank could put 2 or 3 rounds into them before they could reload. This wasn't just theoretical. Combat reports from the Eastern Front described engagements where IS-2 tanks were knocked out because their gunners missed the first shot. The cramped interior didn't help. The huge recoil mechanism of the 122 millimeter gun and the 1/800 millimeter turret ring meant the crew was squeezed into tight quarters. The commander had to double as the loader's assistant, helping manhandle those 25-kilogram shells. In the chaos of combat, under fire, with adrenaline pumping, loading that gun was brutal work. But when it hit, nothing on the battlefield survived. Soviet tankers developed tactics to compensate for the slow reload. IS-2 tanks would advance in groups, coordinating their fire. While one tank reloaded, others would cover it. They learned to pick their shots carefully, aiming for weak points where that massive shell would guarantee a kill, and they relied heavily on the tank's other great advantage, its armor. The early IS-2 model 1943 had a stepped frontal hull. The upper glacis was 120 millimeters at 30 degrees, and the driver's plate was 120 millimeters as well. This was good protection, but there was a problem. The step design created a weak point at the joint between the upper and lower plates. German gunners learned to target this junction where a precise shot could penetrate. In late 1944, Soviet engineers addressed this with the IS-2 model 1944. The The stepped hull was replaced with a single curved casting, 120 millimeters thick, angled at 60 degrees from vertical. This was much harder to penetrate. The effective thickness against a frontal shot was now around 200 millimeters. Even the Tiger II's feared 88 millimeter L-71 gun struggled to penetrate it at normal combat ranges. The Panther had to close to 600 meters to guarantee penetration of the IS-2's frontal armor. Meanwhile, the IS-2 could penetrate the Panther at 1,000 meters or more, depending on the angle and which part of the Panther it hit. Against the Tiger I, the matchup was more even. Both tanks could knock each other out at ranges below 1,000 meters. But the Tiger I had advantages: better accuracy, faster reload, better optics. The IS-2 had raw power and better armor layout. In these duels, crew quality and tactical situation mattered more than the specs on paper. One famous engagement occurred on August 11, 1944, near the Polish town of Ogildau. The German 16th Panzer Division, equipped with 11 of the new Tiger II King Tigers, attacked Soviet positions. The defending Soviet forces included IS-2 tanks from the 71st Independent Guards Heavy Tank Regiment. The sandy terrain forced the massive King Tigers to stick to the roads. Soviet commanders, knowing this, positioned their IS-2 tanks in ambush. When the German attack began, 3 King Tigers were destroyed by IS-2 fire at a range of 800 meters. A 4th King Tiger was knocked out by a T-34-76 at less than 400 meters. Later in the day, Soviet forces counterattacked and found 3 more abandoned King Tigers. Combat between the IS-2 and King Tiger was rare, since only 485 King Tigers were ever produced, and most served on the Western Front. But when they did meet, the engagements were brutal. The King Tiger had thicker frontal armor, 150 millimeters on the glacis at 50 degrees, plus 180 millimeters on the turret front. Its 88 millimeter L-71 gun could penetrate the IS-2 at longer ranges. But the King Tiger was slower, mechanically unreliable, and required constant maintenance. A German report estimated that the King Tiger's frontal armor was immune to the IS-2's 122 millimeter gun. Soviet testing found that the frontal glacis could be destroyed by firing 3 to 4 shots at the weld joints from 500 to 600 meters. The weld quality on late-war German armor was inferior due to material shortages. In practice, if an IS-2 and King Tiger met in combat, the outcome depended on who saw whom first, who got off the first accurate shot, and what the terrain and tactical situation were. The IS-2 crews learned that their tank was not primarily a tank destroyer. It was a breakthrough weapon. Its true power came in urban combat and assaults on fortified positions. In these situations, the 122 millimeter high explosive shell was devastating. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 showcased the IS-2 at its finest. The Red Army assembled over 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft for the final assault on the Nazi capital. Among these were hundreds of IS-2 tanks assigned to Guards heavy tank regiments. These units spearheaded the assault into the city. Soviet tactics for urban warfare were brutally effective. IS-2 tanks would advance down the main streets, supported by infantry. When they encountered a fortified building, strongpoint, or barricade, they would halt. The gunner would aim that 122 millimeter cannon at the structure. One shot, and the building would collapse in a shower of rubble and dust. German defensive positions, bunkers, and pillboxes that could withstand repeated hits from 76 millimeter guns would disintegrate under 122 millimeter fire. The psychological effect was immense. German defenders, many of them poorly trained Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth, would see that massive IS-2 lumber into view and flee, rather than face its cannon. But urban combat was dangerous for any tank. German defenders armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets would ambush Soviet tanks from cellars, upper floors, and around corners. The Hitler Youth, fanatical teenagers armed with these weapons, could destroy an IS-2 at point-blank range. Soviet tankers learned to never advance without infantry support. They would fire into cellars and basements before passing, clearing potential ambush points with high explosive shells or machine gun fire. The civilian cost was horrific, but Soviet forces weren't concerned with collateral damage. One IS-2 commander described the battle as methodical demolition. They would advance a few hundred meters, clear the area, consolidate, then advance again. Progress was measured in city blocks per day. The IS-2's thick frontal armor protected the crew from most German anti-tank weapons at anything beyond point-blank range. By the time Soviet forces reached the Reichstag in late April 1945, IS-2 tanks were among the units that fought in the final battles. Photographs from the victory show IS-2 tanks positioned among the ruins, their crews exhausted but victorious. The Battle of Berlin cost the Red Army over 81,000 dead and 280,000 wounded. Tank losses were heavy, with over 2,800 tanks lost in the operation. But the IS-2 proved its worth as an urban assault weapon. After the war, the IS-2 remained in Soviet service for decades. It participated in the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956, crushing the Hungarian Revolution. During the Cold War, modernized IS-2M variants served with Warsaw Pact nations and Soviet client states. The tank saw combat in the Six-Day War of 1967, where Egyptian IS-2 tanks faced Israeli armor. Some IS-2 variants remained in active service until 1995, an incredible service life for a design from 1943. So, what made the IS-2 significant? It wasn't the best tank of World War II. The King Tiger had better armor and a superior gun for tank combat. The American Pershing was more reliable and had better crew ergonomics. Even the Soviet Union's own IS-3, which entered service too late for combat, addressed many of the IS-2's shortcomings with improved armor and a better turret design. But the IS-2 was exactly what the Soviet Union needed when it needed it. It could be built in large numbers with available resources. Around 3,500 to 4,000 were produced during the war, compared to 485 King Tigers and under 2,500 Pershings. This numerical advantage mattered. Soviet doctrine didn't rely on individual tank superiority. They relied on combined arms tactics, numerical superiority, and operational momentum. The IS-2 fit perfectly into this doctrine. It provided the breakthrough capability to crack German defensive lines. Its 122mm gun could demolish any fortification. When it encountered German heavy tanks, it could fight them, even if it wasn't always at an advantage. And it was simple enough that conscript crews could learn to operate it effectively with basic training. Western observers criticized Soviet tanks for crude construction and lack of finish. They pointed to rough interiors, poor ergonomics, and manufacturing shortcuts. The Soviets' response was pragmatic. These tanks had an average combat life measured in weeks or months. Why waste resources on comfort when the priority was getting as many tanks to the front as possible? The IS-2 embodied Soviet design philosophy. It was designed for a specific job: break through enemy defenses, destroy fortifications, and when necessary, kill German heavy tanks. It did this job effectively enough that the Soviet Union won the war. That massive 122mm gun became iconic. Post-war Soviet heavy tanks, including the IS-3, IS-4, and the final T-10, all retained 122mm main armaments. The doctrine of the heavy breakthrough tank, armed with a gun optimized for both anti-tank and demolition work, defined Soviet armor development until heavy tanks became obsolete in the 1960s. The IS-2 also showed the limitations of the heavy tank concept. By 1944, tank design was reaching diminishing returns. Making tanks heavier meant they became slower, more expensive, harder to transport, and mechanically fragile. The German obsession with building ever bigger tanks, culminating in the 188-ton Maus, was a strategic dead end. The future belonged to medium tanks with heavy firepower, the ancestor of the modern main battle tank. But in 1944 and 1945, when the Red Army needed a hammer to smash the Wehrmacht's last defenses, the IS-2 delivered. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't sophisticated. It was a 46-ton steel fist, wrapped around a 122mm gun, designed to advance, fire, and erase whatever was in front of it. German tankers learned to fear that distinctive profile, the massive gun, and the knowledge that if that cannon hit them, they wouldn't walk away. The IS-2 ended the heavy tank arms race, not through superior engineering, but through brute force applied correctly at the strategic level. In the rubble of Berlin, as IS-2 tanks sat among the ruins of the Reichstag, That was all that mattered. The Soviet hammer had done its job. The Third Reich was destroyed, and the tank that helped deliver that victory became a symbol of Soviet military power for the next 50 years. Today, IS-2 tanks survive in museums around the world. Some are still operational, maintained by collectors and military museums. They serve as reminders of an era when tanks were the decisive weapon of ground warfare, when nations threw millions of tons of steel and millions of lives into brutal, mechanized combat. The IS-2 wasn't the most advanced tank of World War II, but it was effective, it was produced in the numbers needed, and it arrived when the Soviet Union needed it most. In the calculus of war, that's what matters. Not who builds the best tank, but who builds enough good enough tanks to win. The IS-2 was the Soviet Union's good enough tank, and good enough won the war. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.